I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's event, which is on the global reverberations of Russia's war on Ukraine, perspectives on Africa. On February 22nd, 2022, the Kenyan ambassador to the UN, Martin Kimani, in the Security Council issued a scathing rebuke of the previous night's recognition by Russian President Vladimir Putin of Luhansk and Donetsk as independent people republics. Many observers in the West thought that in the days to come, and of course 2 days later, Russia commenced its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, many African states would join the West in condemning the war. Since then, we've had 5 votes in the UN General Assembly, the most recent on March 2nd of this year, on various issues related to the war, from a call for reparations to suspension of Russia from the Human Rights Council. This most recent vote on March 2nd was a simple condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And of the 54 African states, 28 voted to support that condemnation, but many abstained. 1, Eritrea, voted against the resolution, and 8 did not vote altogether. So what explains this slight divergence between Western expectations and hopes early on for an African, if we can call that as being a perspective, joining of the West against Russia, and these vote totals over those 5 UN Security Council resolutions? Perhaps the most dramatic representation, or perhaps the biggest divergence of that journey from original hopes to what has come to pass, is South Africa's original condemnation of the invasion, which then later in February of this year eventually turned into joint military exercises with Russia and China. The Admiral Gorshkov even made it into South African waters, and Russian tankers, at least one sanctioned tanker, has also made it into the port of Cape Town. Well, I'm a Europeanist, so I'm not the one to go to for answers, but I have 3 wonderful colleagues here who know Africa better than anyone in Washington, and so we'll hear from them today about the African perspective on the war. To my immediate left is Ebenezer Obadari, who is the Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow in African Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also the author of Pastoral Power, Clerical State, which is a study of his native Nigeria. And he comes to us previously as an academic from the University of Kansas, where he lived for 17 years. And Josh Meservey is supposed to interject, "Go Jayhawks," at this point.
I refrained.
To his left is Joseph Sani, a native of Cameroon, I believe, who is the Vice President for African Studies at the United States Institute of Peace. He's known as a conflict mediator, consultant, worked a lot with USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, on designing programs in Africa, and someone who's run a lot of Track 1.5, Track 2.0 dialogues. Previously, he was at FHI 360. And to my far left is Hudson's very own Josh Meservey, who is a senior fellow, our senior Africanist here on staff. He came to us from the Heritage Foundation, and prior to that, the Atlantic Council. Most importantly, he was my classmate at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Thanks to all 3 of you for taking the time today. All of them have agreed to give a few minutes of opening remarks on how they frame Russia, Africa, and the war. And after that, we'll have a discussion for the balance of the hour. And I would just, suggest that we move down by order of introduction. So Ebenezer, the floor is yours. Thanks so much for being here, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you, my friend. Good to be here. So let me just make sort of preliminary remarks around 3 or 4 comments. One is that it's only someone who has not been paying attention to relations between the West and Africa that will have been surprised by the way African countries reacted to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the ensuing expectation on behalf of the US and Western countries that African countries would automatically line up with the West. If you've been paying attention, you know that bubbling under the surface has been a lot of grievances. We can go into the details of what those grievances are about and whether or not they're legitimate, but they've always been there. And what I like to call the declaration of insubordination on the part of African countries came against that specific backdrop. That's just to get out there in terms of just a general understanding of the background to the fragmented reaction on the part of African countries. The second point is that I think it's important to know that this is also not Russia's first coming in Africa. I think people tend to sort of forget that. And once you understand that there's a context to Africa's relations with the Soviet Union and now Africa, most of what has been going on falls into place. It makes a lot of sense. And I think, maybe the third point is that I think most of the time, for the most part, we've focused on just the bread and butter part of, why African countries have taken sides with Russia as opposed to taking, sides with the West. And I think that's extremely important. But the other thing I also want to sort of underscore with respect to that is that I think it's also important for African countries to also keep in mind that maybe the most important question here is not just about, what is called allyship. What should Africa go with? I think there's a more important question of where should Africa itself, where should it head? It's true that US-Africa relations, West-Africa relations are at a very crucial conjuncture. I think, as part of that is also the question that I think African countries have to answer about what does taking sides with the United States or Europe, what does it represent? What does taking sides with Russia, what does it symbolize? And I think it's an important moment for African countries themselves to sort of reconsider, what I call their non-negotiable first principles. What are the norms that African countries ought to commit to, and how should the answer to that question about what those norms should be, how should it shape which of the two sides African countries should take? Let me close with sort of a quick mention of some of what African countries have mentioned about what they would like to see and why many of them are reluctant to side with the US and the West. I think one is what you might call justice in the broadest sense, just a sense of fairness about how things are done within the international system. A corollary of that is what you might call a consistent application of rules, sort of a level normative playing field. And then three, greater say within existing international systems, or if the case calls for it, a reconfiguration of many of those institutions. So just wanted to put those out as my own preliminary remarks.
Great.
Yes, thank you for having me. Thank you again. This is a very timely and relevant conversation, and I'm glad we are having that conversation. I think I will, and my brother Obadari said it well. I think he set the stage, the historical perspective, and the reason why there may be that fragmented response. Not all African countries obviously share the same views, so it's nuanced, I'm sure. But I think I will focus a little bit more on the consequences of the war in Africa. There is a rich conversation around the economic consequences, the impact on the 3F, fertilizers, food, and fuel. So I call them the 3F, and those are critical. And then for African countries, were just emerging gradually from COVID, they were hit badly. And there are consequences, not just in terms of economics, development, and conflict and security as well. And also in terms of financing, because as we know, most central banks around the world, to face with the global inflation, decided to increase interest rates, and therefore the debt burden also increased for these countries. But I will focus on the diplomatic reverberations. There are two, I think, from my view. Number one, I think the war in Ukraine has exacerbated the fault lines we already saw between the major powers, and therefore creating a sense of uncertainty for African countries and sudden uncertainty. Those countries were asking themselves how to align. Is it with the West or the rest? And things were happening so quickly, and things are still happening so quickly that we see there is an increased risk of miscalculations. Some of the leaders I'm talking to, some of them, you'll be surprised, question even the votes they took. They did not realize the impact of the vote on the psyche or the political impact in the West of some of the vote or the posture they took. So, and we can understand, so they are forced, there is a sense that African countries are forced to make some false choices. And therefore, it's an attack on their own sovereignty. Because for most African countries, sovereignty also means the freedom to choose. But of course, the freedom to choose also comes with the consequences. And things happen so quickly, and things are so rapid that there is a huge risk of miscalculation. There is a huge risk of uncertainty. And they are rethinking their own alignment, either with the West or the rest, or with some of the major powers, China, Russia, etc. So that's number one, the disruption and the uncertainty that it has created, and with the pressure that comes with it. Number two, and something we are realizing, and the African countries and Africans, citizens, are paying the price, which is the fragmentation of the African peace and security architecture. Because what the war in Ukraine has done, it has exacerbated the paralysis of the UN Security Council. And so therefore, most conflicts now in the region are not resolved at the UN Security Council. So there is no way to deal with those conflicts, no ways to find mechanisms to resolve those conflicts. So what happens? The pressure is on the African peace and security architecture. The AU, we saw it, the AU and Peace and Security Council now is trying to figure out how to deal with this conflict. The political transitions, conflict in Ukraine, conflict in Ethiopia, conflict in DRC. And because they can't do it, they rely on the regional economic community, which were already facing some sort of fragmentation. We see IGAD was already fragmented before the war in Ukraine. But this downward pressure creates further fragmentation and paralysis, leading to a situation where the whole African peace and security architecture becomes almost ineffective. We saw it in the conflict in Ethiopia, where because of the paralysis in the UN Security Council, the paralysis of the AU Peace and Security Council, Kenya has to take the lead, and backed by the United States, and then IGAD later on, to find a way out of Ethiopia. We see it in Sudan today, where the mechanism is not working. And so the United States, the Saudi Arabia, Egypt, IGAD, we are trying to find a way to resolve that conflict. But all these people, there is a clear link between what is happening in Ukraine and the fragmentation that war is creating, and the pressure and the paralysis the war is creating in the UN Security Council between the major powers, and what African countries are experiencing as well. And it's very concerning moving down the road, because if we have a fragmented and inefficient African peace and security architecture, the future is a little bit bleak. I will stop there and then we come down.
And it doesn't seem like there are really pathways to breaking open those log jams, because really great power competition has programmed into it, I think. Exactly. The vetoes at the UN Security Council on nettlesome security issues.
Exactly.
Josh, bring us home.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to just complement what my colleagues here have said. And I'll focus on some of the possible reasons that some African countries have declined to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think it's important, as everybody has alluded to, Africa's not a monolith, obviously, here. There's many different perspectives about Russia, about Ukraine on the continent, so it's worth bearing that in mind. But the reality is that about 50% of the countries that have declined, either by opposing, abstaining, or being absent on these UN resolutions, have been African, right? So that's a big block of countries. So it's worth trying to figure out what's going on here. I'll offer four really quick reasons that I see, and then people can agree or disagree as they choose. So I think Ebenezer referenced the historic ties here. The Soviets were very active on the continent during the Cold War. And perhaps most importantly, they supported some of the liberation movements that are still in power in some of these countries. in Angola, Mozambique, Namibia. South Africa is actually an interesting case because the Soviets supported the ANC, and I think that has some relevance here to how we see the ANC acting today. And the Chinese, who also supported liberation movements on the continent, actually supported the PAC, the Pan-African Congress, which was a rival to the ANC. That's why South Africa and Beijing didn't normalize ties until 1998, 4 years after the fall of the apartheid government. So those historic links are meaningful. You also have current presidents who studied in the Soviet Union. President Nyusi of Mozambique is a graduate of a Soviet university. Same with the current president of Angola, Lorenzo, and his predecessor, Dos Santos, also. There was even a university called the Patrice Lumumba University for decades that operated in the Soviet Union. Patrice Lumumba, of course, was the prime minister of the DRC and was assassinated after a very short time in power. So I think those links are meaningful. I think there's some ideological overlap here as well. On the continent, and again, we're speaking in broad generalities here, so there's going to be exceptions, but there is a distrust or cynicism, I think, of the West. And again, it's very pronounced in certain governments like South Africa, but others as well. And I think when they see the West united on a cause, some African governments reflexively get skeptical. And so that might be an element here as well. And I think part of that is this sense that the international system is unfair. There's a big push right now for an African country to get a seat on the a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. A lot of African countries are going through debt restructuring. Well, some are going through it, others are going to be going through it pretty soon. And there's real frustration about the international financial system and the complications that come with that restructuring and the pace and everything else. So that also feeds into this sense that the international system is unfair. And insofar as Putin is disrupting the international system, that evokes maybe not sympathy, but understanding or something on that level from some African countries. Then I think there are practical, the third reason I'd say there are practical considerations, right? So in 2017, South Africa stopped a nuclear power deal that had been, now former President Jacob Zuma had been working on. Let me see if I get the number right here. It was for $76 billion. It was one of the biggest boondoggles probably ever conceived in the African context. And it was struck between Zuma and a Russian power company. Russia are willing partners in corruption on the continent, and that appeals to some governments and to some particular rulers. Russia, a very important supplier of weapons to the continent, now the #1 supplier, actually more than a quarter of African weapons or weapons that African states have bought come from Russia over the last few years. And then there's military support. So famously, the Wagner mercenary group is active in a bunch of different African countries. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't have concerns around human rights or other things, other nettlesome strings that Western countries will attach to military aid. So I think that's attractive. And then just finally, Russia has made a diplomatic effort in Africa, right? They in 2019, it had its first Russia-Africa summit, very well attended by African heads of state. They rolled out the red carpet. And they've had several since then. In 2019, just a few numbers here, Putin canceled $20 billion of African debt that African states owed to the Soviets. That was never going to be repaid realistically, but it's still a gesture, right? And then we've seen Foreign Minister Lavrov crisscrossing the continent recently. He's been there frequently. So they've put in some sweat equity on the diplomatic front, and I think that has combined with some of these other elements to make a difference. Now, how much any one of these elements is important to any specific country varies, again, widely. Like, I think for some governments, all 4 of these elements are in play. For others, maybe none of them are, and it's a different set of reasons. But I'll throw those 4 out there as sort of general points.
Well, let's stay then with Sergei Lavrov's most recent trip to the continent in January, and then in February. In total, he visited 7 African countries. I think it was Angola, South Africa, the country formerly known as Swaziland, Eswatini, Eritrea, Mauritania, Mali. What does Lavrov offer in those meetings? I mean, maybe we'll start with you, Josh. What do the Russians say to these African leaders when they land in their capitals? What's the play on offer?
It probably varies depending where they are. So the discussions in Eswatini are probably very different from the discussions in Mali. Mali is right at the center of a vicious surge of terrorist activity in the Sahel, and that is where Wagner Group is quite active and has been for some years. The French were forced to withdraw, actually, in large part, probably because of Russian activity there. So I think Lavrov can offer a government like Mali's, which is a coup government, so it's been diplomatically isolated, including by the region. ECOWAS reacted pretty strongly to the coup there. It can offer it diplomatic ties. It can break some of the international isolation that these coup governments are experiencing. And it's really important to remember, again, Russia has a Security Council veto. And so in that sense, it can protect governments at the UN. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's very frank conversations around those sorts of issues. And then there's these security cooperation agreements that they strike. There's been an increase in trade, for instance, and they also have state-owned oil companies that are active. So there's a toolkit there that Lavrov can reach into.
When you look at again, it's hard to speak of Africa because from east to west to south to not just sub-Saharan Africa, but also the Maghreb, there are different calculations, and even within those sub-regions, different countries, national interests at play. So I hate to generalize, but we have 45 minutes to solve the continent's problems. So, I'll head there anyways. How do you think these countries, unless you just resolve this question by saying elite capture and cronyism, which is a play or an opportunity available to the Russians that's not really something that Americans can offer, given our system and the way we approach foreign affairs, how do these countries weight the ideological issues that Josh mentioned, the legacy questions dating back to the Soviet era, and their basic pecuniary interests, their business interests? Because it strikes me that if it's the former and it's heavily ideologized, it's very difficult for the United States to break through on that. It's very difficult to overcome cronyism and elite capture. But you can compete on the economic front, and there are vehicles like AGOA or specific initiatives like PEPFAR that have made a difference over the years. So I don't know if I'm taking you here to Washington to talk about how the United States can try to work on that, or whether I'm taking you to the region and asking how those are weighted. But maybe you could just address that balance writ large.
Yeah, I think first of all, Russia, in terms of, is a player but not a major player. Okay, so let's put things in perspective. Even in terms of commercial trade, they are a major player when it comes to weapons or security provision, so that's clear. But in terms of investment, trade, etc., they are not. China is the big player, and then the United States and the EU. Russia comes really down the pipe, so just to put it in context. And I think there is a narrative. Russia, when you track Lavrov's moves or Wagner, you will see there is a clear line. There is the instability belt. So Russia will provide a particular service to those governments in need of security and weapons and things like that. Where I think, so first, Russia is not the major competitor to the United States. If competition there is, it's not. There is an overblown narrative. Number two, yes, we can do more. I think we can discuss what the U.S. can do. We advocate they can flip the script, start with trade than aid. But the U.S. story in Africa is quite successful. It's not that we don't have the kind of creativity to tell our story as we do, so to tell what we do, really. Remember, Russia does not have, you mentioned PEPFAR. PEPFAR saved about 25 million lives on the continent when everybody was turning their back to Africa. AGOA lifted hundreds of thousands of Africans out of poverty. But we don't tell that story. We are not very good at telling our story. And so therefore, investment, working with Africans themselves to tell the story, I think will be the best way to go. And compared to Russia and whether it is China, I think the United States has a very distinct model where the US works with whole of a society. The United States engages all stakeholders on the continent. Russia, China, and maybe the former colonial powers engage the elite. And so when you look at even statistics, in terms of the Afrobarometer latest statistics, the US fares very well in terms of the quality, in terms of social, institutional capital. So the African citizens still value the United States model and what the US is doing, not Russia. So we just have to I just wanted to clarify that.
No, that's because, the Russian GDP is 1.4 to 1.7 trillion. The US GDP is around 20. If you add in its allies in Europe, who are all arrayed against the Russians in this war, that, doubles essentially to nearly 40 trillion. So you think it would be a one-sided fight? Do some of these abstentions, like the 17 that abstained or the 8 that didn't vote in this March 2nd General Assembly resolution, think they're currying favor with China when they vote, or when they don't vote in favor of the resolution, or is that a step too far?
I think I will not say it's a step too far, but there are multiple factors in. So as I said at the beginning, so this war has disrupted the traditional diplomatic ties. And African countries, like all other countries, are rethinking their relationship and their interest in this changing global landscape. And so those who are abstaining are just hedging their bets. It's pure calculation. And some who voted for, really some of them maybe are also signaling something to the West. Not because they are against the West. It is. So I think I will not read that vote literally. Like, I know in Washington, D.C. we count. Yeah. We count. But I think there is more to their posture than just we are for Russia or we are against Ukraine. I think there is more to it. It's a much more nuanced expression of something going on.
And it probably also reflects, I think, a bit of sort of tacit recognition that there's some hypocrisy in the West. I mean, if this conflict were taking place in a region of the world less vital to American interests, we would be calling for a ceasefire on day one, rather than pumping weapons in to support the Ukrainians and trying to encourage and support the Ukrainians to victory. So I think that's all well taken. Same with immigration. There are very few, if any, complaints about Ukrainian refugees flowing into Europe. But if you remember the Syrian crisis a few years ago, to this day, there's a lot of, I think, tension in Europe about those refugee flows, and anticipatory, given Africa's demographic boom that is upcoming, one of the few parts of the world that is growing. Probably similar, I think, rhetoric that I'm guessing frustrates, some African leaders and leads to this. If I can go to you, to Ebenezer, about A, to either refute anything I just said, or B, to the Wagner Group, which both of you have raised. You have yet, so I'll drag you into that, into the Wagner discussion. You're hot off a plane from Nairobi, so well informed on what's happening in East Africa and in Central Africa. Have you detected more or less Wagner activity since the start of the war in Ukraine? Is this something that, given their resource constraints and their heavy focus on Ukraine, has forced them to pull back? Or, given that they are considered, at least in part, a mercenary outfit, they've doubled down to try to extract more resources and fund their activities? Yeah. How has the war shaped Wagner in Africa?
It's more. So there are two levels of conflict unfolding simultaneously. So there is the Russian attempt to pacify Ukraine. We know what's going on there. It's not been all that successful. But part of what I think has also transpired, and my colleagues have mentioned this, is that the struggle between Russia and the United States for influence in Africa has intensified since the conflict started. And if anything, and Lavrov's visit to Africa sort of, I think, supports that, if anything, Russia now sees Africa as a stage, as a theater, where that conflict needs to be resolved. So it's in the process of recruiting allies. I won't be surprised if in the next 3 or 4 months, Lavrov visits again. Several African leaders have visited Russia, since the conflict started. So that's we're in a state of flux where both the United States and the West on one side, and Russia on the other side are trying to recruit allies and to keep allies, to maintain a particular level of solidarity. So the footprint of the Wagner Group has predictably gotten bigger in Africa.
You mentioned food, fuel, and fertilizer earlier, the 3 Fs. What or where concretely has the war most impacted Africa? Is it in grain prices? Is it in certain indicators? And does that in part explain also the desire for resolution, ceasefire, ending of the conflict?
I think food, fertilizers. I think that's food insecurity has been, I think, the main area of impact. And because when you combine to that climate change, drought, flooding, etc., I mean, most African countries have been hit very hard, particularly in the Sahel. It's been, the damage is really of epic proportion. And so again, the United States has acted swiftly. I mean, they provided aid, but those problems reflect the need of really structural transformation. This is also an opportunity, and this is the responsibility of African countries, to seize on the moment, to rethink their agricultural systems, right? And also, for their partners, and particularly the United States can play a role here. And that's one of the hope, or we hope after the African Leaders Summit, that a follow-up of the African Leaders Summit is to see how partnerships, serious partnerships, can be built to transform the agri-business sector in Africa, right? So, because it is really a paradox that Africa has 65% of the remaining arable land, and with Africa is experiencing food insecurity. So there is an opportunity here for the United States, given the resources and the leverage the United States has with development finance institutions, etc., to really work with Africans to rethink the agricultural sector. But to answer to your question, food insecurity is still the biggest casualty of this war in Africa.
Do you see that similarly?
Yes, but it then begs, and I think my colleague flagged that, it begs other questions. So you mentioned one word, agribusiness. So there is agri, but there is also the business part of it. It does raise the question of why the business part has not been so successful in an African context. But that the level of exposure that African countries have had, especially in the Central Sahel, over the last 12 months, it has to then raise fundamental questions about why is it that fully independent countries, autonomous countries, cannot attain food security. If it's about drought, why is it that drought is not being properly managed? And I've sort of hinted at this before. I think beyond all of this, and my colleague is absolutely right about the level of food insecurity, fuel, and all of that, that one hopes that the political elite in different African countries would then step back a little bit and say, hold on, what if this conflict does not end in another 5 years? Are we going to be going with the bowl in hand to beg other parts of the world to feed us? So to the extent that this helps to put pressure in the right way, in the right places, within the administrative and political structures in African countries, this might actually be a good thing for Africa.
Well, there's an analysis that, in part, Putin views the operation in Ukraine as a cleansing operation because it's identifying all of the corruption, all of the problems in his military, and so it's almost in an incredibly perverse and perhaps just propagandistic way a rejuvenation of the Russian armed forces, because while he's destroying it, he's also recognizing where its weak points lay, and by really unmooring or unloosening this humanitarian crisis through high food prices, maybe some of the weaknesses in some African states could be identified as well. Josh, if you were to walk into Tony Blinken's office, and he's right. I know you're planning on doing that after this discussion, but how would you say, not to counter program Lavrov, but what should the Americans be doing? Specifically with the idea of Russia in the region in mind.
Yeah, I think there's some parallels here with how the U.S. tries to grapple with China's presence on the continent. There's a real wariness, I think, that has grown up on the continent about anything that suggests the United States is trying to force a choice on African countries. And I don't think the U.S. is doing that, but some of the messaging has been very clumsy, as always. So I would urge the U.S. government to make this less about Russia bad and more about United States good. There's a place for pointing out the problems with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and et cetera, et cetera. But I generally think those discussions are better held in private settings rather than public lectures. And more to the point, I would say, again, about America good messaging, the U.S. should be telling our African friends, some decades ago, you were on a developmental par with South Korea and Japan. And now those countries are wealthy, they're secure, whereas a lot of African states still deeply struggle, right, both with poverty and insecurity, and say, you know, and this is well known, this is actually a source of angst. You talk to African intellectuals and they will oftentimes reference South Korea or Japan, and because they're very aware of this history. And the U.S. should say, you know, one of the central reasons that South Korea and Japan have advanced in the way they have is that they just became rock solid American allies. They were all in with the United States as partners, and it's more complex than that, but that is a central element of their developmental story. And I think that alone could be a powerful element of messaging to our African friends. And there's a lot of other things that we should be saying, but I would kind of start there. Say, like, look, here are the obvious benefits, as proven throughout history, of partnering with the United States, and you know we want to do that with you. And if I may, the U.S. needs to soft pedal some of the public lecturing of African states. I agree with some of those public lectures, but they get us nowhere. They're oftentimes counterproductive, actually. I think those hard conversations should be private conversations and not delivered from a lectern somewhere or tweeted out to a domestic political constituency.
Yeah, I mean, my layman's attitude, and I think this applies to a lot of regions of the world, is that the U.S. tries to build an order because it has enough power and weight behind it to construct a European order or an East Asian order. And that's really on account of its GDP and those of its partners and allies. Russia can't quite build an order, but it can disrupt one, and it can try to tear one down. Really, to any of the three of you, although I suppose, Ebenezer, you mentioned the Wagner Group and Russia moving into the belt of instability. Again, an opportunistic play to disrupt development and to pull a potential partner away from the French. Josh mentioned the withdrawal of the French from Mali. Is there such a thing as a Russian grand strategy for Africa that you can detect anywhere? I mean, I suppose the port of Sudan would be a breakout into the Red Sea, or through Libya to frustrate European operations in the Mediterranean, even through Algeria. But do you view that as sort of, if you even view that as plays, is that opportunism? Is there more to it? I mean, can we speak of a grand strategy?
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
Okay.
And you sort of, in order to understand that, in order to see this very clearly, you have to put Russia in the same compartment as China. Because I think there's a sort of organic relationship between the two, and there's a philosophical coherence to their vision. What does Russia want in Africa? Just look at the countries that it has developed solid interactions with. These are either out-and-out authoritarian states or countries with wannabe autocrats. So the signal is very clear. The model of governance that Vladimir Putin would like to institute in Africa is the top-down, centralized, authoritarian state. So that's the grand strategy. And if you think about it, notionally at least, that's the exact opposite of what the United States and the West want. So there's a strategy there. But let me make a side comment and sort of tie it to what you were saying earlier about how the United States should proceed. And it seems to me that it's true, the hectoring, the lecture, maybe you want to dial that back a little bit. But look, if you lock me up in the same room with Cyril Ramaphosa, we're not going to come to blows, but all I'm going to tell him is, at the end of the day, this is not about the United States. This is not about Europe. This is about your country. The bigger question here, this is drawing on what Josh said earlier, is what is in this for African countries? It's not about whether you partner Russia or the United States. You're going to double your population in the next 20, 25 years. What kind of society are you going to be? I think that's the more important question. And whether or not you go with the United States or Russia, that's going to be completely up to you. How do you build a prosperous society in which fundamental human rights are taken for granted? How do you get there? If you want to become South Korea or Singapore, those countries did not just become the countries that they are. It's true that they're allies of the West. But the reason that they are is because there is ideological compatibility between them and the West/United States. So, for me, those are the more critical questions.
Well, and that gets back to the balance between sort of an ideologized foreign policy, which I think the ANC can be accused of, and based on the economic self-interest of a growing population that you need to create opportunities for. And on the latter count, I do think the U.S. can be a good partner. If it's the former and we're arguing about U.S. policy towards Cuba, which strikes me as totally irrelevant for a country like South Africa, it's going to be hard. Sani, if I could, feel free to add on to that. But can I also ask you, again, as someone not well-versed in Africa, one thing I do know is the acronym BRICS. Is that still a thing? Is it relevant? I hear the South Africans oftentimes hanging on to it and clinging to it as an important regional format, or is it basically now just a Chinese-dominated forum with little to offer? How should we think about the BRICS? Should we watch the BRICS meetings with bated breath?
No, I think it's important. I think because, again, in this fragmented world, where we have the emergence of all these centers of power, the BRICS, yes, we should consider it with interest. I think it offers another way out for others, other countries. So we can't disregard the BRICS. I think it's an important forum, and we should be watching what's happening there carefully, because they will also increase their membership at some point. It's all this form of alternative to the West, right? Maybe the BRICS today, maybe the Development Bank, or all these alternative forms should be watched carefully, because we see the emergence of counterbalancing institutions to Western institutions that are accused of injustice and etc., letting down African people. But to come back quickly to what Obe was saying, I think, yes, African countries have agency and responsibility, right? That's important. They have to ask themselves what's in for us, what's the next steps, etc. That's important. But I also think that we have to differentiate between the leaders and citizens. And I think the United States also can help or foster the emergence of this democratic momentum that we see, and that willingness of citizens really to live in a democratic society So there is a difference here. When you look at Sudan, you see what the Sudanese people are asking, and they are dying for. They are dying for these ideals we share here in the United States. And I think it will be strategic for the United States to support this kind of movement, to expand the base of stakeholders who share, or the vast majority of Africans, who share the ideas, these ideas of justice, human rights, holding leaders accountable. We should not just focus or look at the behaviors or the calculation of leaders. That's what China does well. That's what the Russians are doing. But the United States, we can go beyond. And we have been doing it, but we have to resource to invest more on other stakeholders, not just the leaders.
Yeah, although that's also then domestically difficult when you're investing in peoples whose leaders might be considered problematic, but point taken. Josh, related to that, I started off by citing the General Assembly votes and sort of foisted that metric onto the discussion. But in closing, those of us who watch the war carefully in Ukraine, but Africa less so, what should we be looking for in the months ahead? Are there metrics or moments? Is it the General Assembly? Is it the big capitals like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa? How should those of us who don't spend every day immersed in the African press, how should we follow the continent with specific regard to this question?
I mean, frankly, I'm not sure a lot's going to change as far as Africa's position on the war. In some ways, for all the reasons we've been discussing, they've chosen their positions, and I think Sani is right. Some are perhaps second guessing, but they're also a little bit locked in at this point. If you've been through 5 UN votes, it's unless something dramatic happens, it's a little hard to make a big switch there. So that's my sense, is that probably this is the international diplomatic landscape as far as Africa is concerned regarding the Ukraine war. Now, maybe there's some truly dramatic event that,
like the Black Sea gets shut down again.
Yeah, there might be something, right? Like, I mean, God forbid, tactical nukes get deployed or something that could be some sort of red line for African countries. But
you think that would be potentially a red line?
I'm not even. I don't know, actually. I mean, I'm not sure. I throw it out there as an example, but maybe.
Yeah. I mean, it would be a case of red line for what, right?
Yeah.
If you think it's the Europeans' war, then nuclear weapons? Okay, well, good luck.
Right.
It will depend on how the dynamics of the war, of this war, right? So we saw that when the Ukrainians are successful, they have the support of the world. So when they are not, people second guess. Yeah. So I think it depends on one hand the dynamics of the war, what Russia will do, and how Ukraine will react to that, and it will also depend on the consequences of that on the daily life of Africans. It's really, so it's not, I mean, I take your point, it's not ideological, frankly. People are making calculations, and because of the speed of the pace of the war, there are miscalculations. So it's a really rational choice, rational decision African countries are making. So it will depend on the context, on the dynamics of the war, and the level of pressure or incentive that the West will also deploy. Yeah. Right? So it will depend on all those things. For example, African countries are looking at the promises made during the African Leaders Summit. So if all of a sudden, in the next couple of months, etc., the United States is following through the promises, it may change the dynamics. France has an investment forum in June in Paris to discuss issues of the debt. So all those things will play out. African countries are also, just like all countries, thinking about this in rational terms.
Yeah, and the Ukrainians themselves are also working on this, right? Like Zelensky, President Zelensky has said publicly that they want to focus more of their diplomatic efforts on Africa, and they've had some phone calls with African leaders. So, the Ukrainians are doing what they can. What I find so interesting, and I agree with Sani that these are rational calculations. But the ANC case is really interesting. That's less rational to me, right? Because if you think about Russian trade is like something like 0.4% of South Africa's trade, or it's minuscule. And Sani referenced this. Russia in general is not a huge economic player on the continent. It just isn't. In a few specific sectors, it's important, but across the board, no. So why the ANC is so persistent and so I don't want to use the word flagrant, but so public in their support of Russia, the joint exercises. Now, to be fair, there had been some before the Ukraine war, so it wasn't totally unprecedented, but still, obviously, the international situation had changed by the time this latest round came about. And then they're almost certainly going to host Vladimir Putin for the BRICS summit. They're not going to arrest him. I'm sorry, ICC fans, they're not going to arrest him, right? Like, it's not going to happen. So to me, that's really interesting, right? Like, to me, it seems a bit irrational how, and maybe the result of an ideological position more than anything from the ANC on this specific question, because they're just, I don't see many practical gains for the South Africans from their approach to Russia.
You see, you said the South Africans, and the ANC is not the South Africans.
I was shorthand.
They are losing political clout. There are internal political dynamics within the ANC that may justify or help explain the posture, right? So it's not. So we have to understand maybe not the South African, of course, South African position because they are in the government, but I think it's what can help us understand that position will be the internal dynamics within the ANC itself, the political dynamics inside the ANC. And they are feeling the pressure from the extreme left side of their own parties. And so that will may help us understand the position of the South African government. It's not South Africa, but the dynamics within the ANC. And I will bet you, if the ANC lose elections next time around, you will see a flip in the South African position. If the opposition parties take over, you will see a flip in the South African position vis-à-vis this war.
Right.
So I think it's more an internal dynamics within the ANC.
Well, and the DA has said publicly that they would arrest Putin if he ventured into Western Cape, which they control. I think you're right about the internal.
DA being the opposition, of course.
Yeah, sorry, Democratic Alliance,
Alliance.
the main South African opposition party. So.
Well, thanks to the three wise men sitting here. Thanks so much to those of you watching this online.